11:47 p.m. The digits on my phone screen glowed in the dark, like something alive, something watching me as the ocean outside whispered against the shore in slow, steady breaths. I had only been in the house for a few hours, my house, the one I had spent 12 years building toward every decision, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, quietly stacking into this single moment of arrival, and I was still sitting on the back porch, barefoot, a glass of wine untouched in my hand, letting the reality settle into my bones. Sullivan's Island was quiet at night, the kind of quiet that felt earned, not empty. The air carried salt and possibility, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, there was no pressure behind my ribs, no voice in my head asking me to prove anything to anyone. I had finally made it somewhere that belonged to me. Then my phone vibrated. The name on the screen was enough to tighten something deep in my chest before I even answered Victoria. I hadn't spoken to her in months, not because of a dramatic fallout, but because silence had always been easier than explaining myself to someone who had already decided who I was. Still, something about that night, about the fragile, foolish hope that maybe distance had softened her, made me swipe to answer. "Paige told me about your little beach house," she said, skipping any form of greeting, her voice already carrying that sharp managerial tone she used when she wasn't asking for something, but announcing it. I didn't respond. I had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than interruption. She continued, filling the space as if it belonged to her. "How nice. Listen, your father and I have been thinking we need a change of scenery. The city's been exhausting. We're moving in tomorrow." The words didn't register all at once. They landed in pieces like glass falling in slow motion, each shard catching the light before it cut. "Moving in, tomorrow." I stared out at the dark horizon where the ocean disappeared into the sky, and for a second I genuinely wondered if I had misheard her. "I'm sorry," I said carefully, my voice quieter than I expected. "What?" "The master bedroom, obviously," she went on as if clarifying something minor. "Paige will take the room with the ocean view. You can have the one in the back. It's small, but you're used to small." My fingers tightened around the glass until I felt the thin edge press into my skin. The wine trembled, reflecting the porch light in fractured ripples. "Did Dad actually say that?" I asked. "Can I talk to him?" There was a brief pause, just long enough to feel intentional. "He's sleeping," she said. "Don't wake him, you know his heart. And honestly, Bonnie, if you don't like it, you can find somewhere else. It's not like you can't afford a motel." There it was, not just entitlement, not just assumption, but dismissal, clean and practiced, delivered with the same casual certainty she had used for 15 years whenever she decided what I deserved. Something in my chest shifted then, not breaking, not collapsing, but aligning. My hands were shaking violently enough now that I had to set the glass down on the wooden railing before I dropped it, but my face remained still, my voice steady when I spoke again. "Sure, Victoria," I said almost gently. "I'll prepare everything for your arrival." She didn't say goodbye. She never did. The line went dead, and the quiet that followed was different from the quiet before, sharper charged, like the moment just before a storm breaks. I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, staring at nothing, feeling everything rearrange itself inside me. Because the truth was, this wasn't surprising. Not really. Victoria had been rewriting the boundaries of my life since she walked into it, inch by inch, year by year, testing how much she could take, how much I would give, how invisible I was willing to become to keep the illusion of family intact. She had taken my room, my place at the table, my father's attention, my history, even the way I saw myself. And for 15 years I had let her. Not because I was weak, but because I believed stupidly, persistently, that if I stayed quiet long enough, if I worked hard enough, if I didn't make trouble, eventually I would be seen. That night, sitting on the porch of a house I had paid for entirely on my own, I finally understood something I should have learned years ago. She wasn't misunderstanding me. She was measuring me, and she had just made her final calculation. I picked up my phone again, my hands steadier now, and dialed my father. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert, not asleep. "Sweetheart," he said, "is everything okay?" I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that single word settle. Sweetheart, a word that still carried echoes of something real, something that hadn't been completely erased. "Did you tell Victoria she could move into my house?" I asked. There was a pause, then confusion, immediate and unfiltered. "What? No. She said you invited us down for the weekend." The last piece slid into place with quiet precision. Not a misunderstanding, not a miscommunication, a lie. Clean, intentional, familiar. I opened my eyes and looked out at the ocean again, but it felt different now. Not peaceful, but vast. Like something that had been waiting for me to notice it properly. "Okay," I said softly. "That's all I needed to know." After we hung up, I didn't go back inside. I stayed on the porch, the night air cooling the heat that had risen under my skin, and for the first time in 15 years I wasn't sad. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't even angry in the way I had been before, reactive, messy, consuming. What I felt instead was clarity. Cold, precise, undeniable clarity. Because Victoria hadn't just crossed a line. She had exposed the entire pattern. And patterns once seen could be broken. I stood up slowly, picked up my glass, and took a sip of wine that had long since lost its chill. It didn't matter. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was what came next. She thought she was arriving tomorrow to take something from me. She thought this was just another room, another boundary, another quiet surrender she could orchestrate without consequence. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that her call hadn't just been an intrusion, it had been a trigger. The last one, because I wasn't the same person she had been managing for the past decade and a half. I wasn't the quiet girl standing at the edge of family photos waiting to be invited in. I wasn't the one who absorbed every slight and translated it into motivation, into discipline, into silent success she never bothered to notice. I had built something real, something measurable, something protected, and more importantly, I had learned how to see. I looked back at my phone one last time, the call log still open, her name sitting there like a challenge. Then I smiled, not out of politeness, not out of habit, but because, for the first time, I understood exactly where I stood, and exactly what I was going to do. My mother died in September, and I remember the exact way the hospital room smelled that morning, sterile, too clean, like something had been erased before I was ready to let it go. Ovarian cancer, they had said back in April, using words that sounded clinical and manageable, as if naming it properly would somehow contain it. But 5 months later, there was nothing contained about the way her hand felt in mine, lighter than it should have been. Her voice softer, slower, fading between sentences as though even speaking required more energy than she had left. I was 17, old enough to understand what was happening, too young to know what to do with the silence that followed after she was gone. The house changed immediately, not in any dramatic way at first, but in the absence of her, the way mornings became quieter dinners, less structured laughter, something that happened on television instead of in the kitchen. My father coped the only way he knew how, by working longer hours, burying himself in contracts and clients, and anything that required logic instead of emotion. And for a while it was just the two of us orbiting the same space, both pretending that routine could replace what we had lost. Then, 2 years later, he met Victoria. At first, she was exactly what I thought we needed. Warm, attentive, someone who filled the rooms with conversation and small gestures that felt like care. She brought homemade desserts to Sunday dinners, called me sweetheart in a tone that sounded sincere enough to believe. And for a brief, fragile period of time, I allowed myself to think that maybe this was what healing looked like. Not replacing my mother, but rebuilding something new around the space she had left behind. But warmth, I would learn, can be a performance. And 6 months after the wedding, the performance ended. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment I could point to and say, this is when everything changed. It started small, almost reasonable, the kind of adjustments that could be explained away if you wanted to avoid conflict badly enough. Victoria suggested that I move out of my childhood bedroom, the one with the window seat my mother had built where I used to sit and read while she cooked downstairs, so that Paige, her daughter, could have more space for her things, a proper dressing room, she said, as if that were a necessity, rather than a preference. I remember standing in the doorway, looking at my father, waiting for him to say something, anything that acknowledged what that room meant, not just as a space, but as a piece of the life we had lost. He didn't. He put a hand on my shoulder, gentle, apologetic in a way that required no actual action, and said, "It's just a room, kiddo." It was never just a room, it was the first thing that disappeared. After that, it became easier for things to shift, for lines to move, without being named. By Christmas that year, I wasn't in the family photo. Victoria had arranged everyone in front of the fireplace, positioning them with the careful precision of someone curating an image, and when I walked into the room there was no space left. "Oh," she said, adjusting Paige's collar without looking at me, "I thought you said you didn't want to be in it." I hadn't said that, but I also didn't argue. I learned quickly that correcting her never changed the outcome, it only made me look difficult, ungrateful, sensitive. So I stepped back and they took the picture without me, a framed version of a family I was technically still part of, just not visibly included in. The pattern continued in ways that were subtle enough to deny, consistent enough to define everything. Paige went to a private university, fully funded by my father, while I took a scholarship to the College of Charleston and worked 2 part-time jobs to cover everything else, telling myself I preferred independence because that was the narrative that had been assigned to me. When I once asked my father about the difference, he looked genuinely confused, as if the disparity hadn't registered until I pointed it out, and before he could respond, Victoria stepped in with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "You've always been so self-sufficient, Bonnie. We didn't want to take that away from you." It sounded like a compliment. It functioned like an excuse. Over time, I stopped asking. At family dinners, the ones I was still invited to, though they became less frequent each year, my life was reduced to vague summaries, my work dismissed with a casual wave of her hand. "Bonnie does something with spreadsheets," Victoria would say, redirecting attention almost immediately. "Paige, tell them about your latest campaign, sweetheart." And Paige would, animated, confident, occupying the space that had once been shared. I didn't blame her, not entirely. It's easy to step forward when someone else is being quietly moved aside. What hurt wasn't just what Victoria did, but how easily the rest of the world adjusted to it, how quickly I became background noise in my own life. The small things were always the hardest to explain to anyone outside of it. It wasn't just the room or the photo or the tuition. It was the way my preferences were never asked for, only assumed. The way decisions were made around me, not with me. The way my presence became optional, conditional, something that could be included or excluded depending on how convenient it was for everyone else. And perhaps the most damaging part of all was how gradually it happened, how each individual moment felt too minor to justify confrontation, but together, over years, they built something undeniable, a version of reality where I existed but didn't quite belong. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had adapted in ways I didn't even recognize at first. I stopped expecting acknowledgement. I stopped volunteering information about my life. I learned how to be agreeable, how to minimize myself in conversations, so there was no friction, no reason for anyone to feel uncomfortable around me. I became efficient at invisibility. And the strange thing about being invisible inside your own family is that it teaches you 2 things at once: how little space you're allowed to take up, and how much you can build when no one is paying attention. But back then, before the success, before the independence, before the house, and the life I would eventually create for myself, all I knew was the quiet, persistent ache of being replaced in places that were supposed to be permanent. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was steady, like something eroding from the inside out, shaping who I became, long before I realized I had the power to shape anything at all. By the time I left for college, I had already learned something that would shape every decision I made for the next decade. If no one was going to build a future for me, I would build it myself quietly, methodically, and without expecting recognition along the way. I chose the College of Charleston not because it was prestigious, but because it was practical. A full scholarship meant I could graduate without debt, and at that point freedom mattered more to me than status. I worked 2 part-time jobs from my first semester, one shelving books at a small independent bookstore near King Street, the other tutoring statistics for students who had quickly realized that understanding probability was harder than it sounded. My days were structured with a precision that left little room for anything else. Classes in the morning, work in the afternoon, studying late into the night. I didn't have the luxury of drifting or experimenting the way some of my classmates did. Every hour had a purpose, every decision a consequence, and while other people talked about finding themselves, I focused on building something that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I chose finance as my major not because I had some grand passion for markets, but because I understood what money represented. Options control the ability to walk away when something stopped serving you. Numbers made sense in a way people didn't. They were consistent, logical, responsive to effort. If you made the right decisions often enough, they reflected that back to you. That clarity became a kind of refuge. After graduation, I accepted a junior analyst position at Meridian Strategy Group, a boutique consulting firm in downtown Charleston that specialized in restructuring mid-sized companies. It wasn't glamorous work and the hours were relentless, but it offered something I valued more than comfort: exposure to systems, to how businesses actually functioned beneath the surface. How decisions at the top rippled through entire organizations. I learned quickly, partly because I had to, partly because I had spent years observing dynamics that others overlooked. Within the first year, I was handling client data sets that had previously been reserved for more senior staff. By the second, I was sitting in on strategy meetings, not speaking much but listening carefully, mapping patterns, understanding where value was created and where it was lost. I didn't try to stand out. I focused on being effective. That distinction mattered. By my third year, I was leading small client engagements, managing restructuring projects for companies whose annual revenues exceeded $50 million. And by my seventh, I had become a senior strategy consultant, overseeing portfolios that crossed $200 million. My compensation grew accordingly, not dramatically at first, but steadily, predictably. Base salary increases, performance bonuses, retention incentives, all of it accumulating, in a way that felt less like sudden success and more like the inevitable result of sustained discipline. By the time I left the firm, my annual income, including bonuses, was approximately $340,000. No one in my family knew. They never asked. And I never offered the information. At family dinners, when my work came up at all, it was summarized in the same dismissive way it always had been: reduced to something vague and inconsequential. "Bonnie works with spreadsheets," Victoria would say, and I would nod, allowing the understatement to stand, because correcting it would have required explaining a life they had never shown interest in understanding. Instead, I redirected my energy towards something that mattered more than being seen: building security. Starting in 2013, I began investing aggressively but strategically. I allocated a fixed percentage of every paycheck into low-cost index funds, prioritizing long-term growth over short-term gains. I avoided lifestyle inflation, deliberately maintaining a standard of living that was well below what I could technically afford. I drove a 7-year-old Honda, wore clothes that were functional rather than impressive, and resisted the quiet social pressure to display success in ways that invited commentary. The difference between what I earned and what I spent became my leverage. Within 2 years, I had saved enough to purchase my first rental property, a modest duplex in West Ashley. It wasn't perfect. There were repairs, tenant issues, unexpected costs, but it generated consistent cash flow and, more importantly, taught me how to manage assets beyond theory. A year later, I acquired a second property, a townhouse near the medical university, using a combination of saved capital and carefully structured financing. Each investment was calculated, not speculative. I wasn't trying to get rich quickly. I was building something stable, something that would compound over time without requiring constant attention. By the time I reached my early 30s, the numbers had become significant enough to change the way I thought about work entirely. My investment portfolio, combined with my real estate holdings and accumulated savings, had grown to approximately $5.2 million. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't announce it. I simply acknowledged it for what it was. Proof that consistency works even when no one is watching. The only person who knew the full scope of my financial position was Marcus Trent, the attorney I had retained in 2019 to help structure my assets and ensure everything was legally protected. Marcus was precise, thorough, and most importantly, discreet. He treated my finances not as a curiosity, but as a system that required maintenance, optimization, and foresight. Together, we reviewed contracts, adjusted ownership structures, and ensured that everything I had built was secured against risks I might not yet see. Outside of that, my life remained intentionally understated. I showed up to family events in the same way I always had: quiet, polite, unremarkable, in ways that made other people comfortable. I let them believe whatever version of me they had already decided on, because it no longer affected what I was actually building. And that was the key difference. For years, I had equated being unseen with being diminished. Now I understood it as something else entirely: freedom. Because while they were focused on appearances, on narratives, on who seemed successful and who didn't, I was operating on a different level entirely, one defined not by perception but by measurable, irreversible progress. I wasn't waiting to be acknowledged anymore. I was preparing for something they didn't even realize existed. The first sign that something was wrong didn't arrive with drama or urgency. It came quietly, almost casually, buried in a conversation that at the time felt routine. It was July 2024, and I was sitting across from Marcus Trent in his office, a glass-walled space overlooking East Bay Street, reviewing a set of documents related to my father's estate planning. The meeting had nothing to do with suspicion. If anything, it was precautionary, an exercise in organization, making sure that if anything ever happened, everything was accounted for, protected, structured properly. Marcus was methodical in a way I had come to trust completely. He didn't rush, he didn't speculate. He observed, cross-referenced, verified. So when he paused mid-sentence, his attention narrowing on a single page, I noticed. "There's a transfer deed here for your father's Mount Pleasant property," he said, his tone neutral but focused. "Dated April 12, 2024. I nodded. Not immediately concerned. My father had always managed his own real estate matters. It wasn't unusual for him to move assets around, especially given his background as an attorney. "Anything unusual?" I asked. Marcus didn't answer right away. He rotated the document slightly, studying the signature at the bottom of the page. "The signature looks off," he said finally. "Not wrong, not fake, just off." The word hung in the air longer than it should have. "Off how?" I asked. He slid the document across the desk toward me, pointing to the name Gerald A. Beckett. At first glance, it looked legitimate. The letters were there, the flow was similar, the general shape recognizable. But the longer I stared at it, the more something felt misaligned. The capital G lacked the distinctive loop I had seen in my father's handwriting for years. The pen pressure seemed uneven, heavier at the start, lighter at the finish, as if the person writing it had been concentrating too hard on getting it right. "It could be nothing," Marcus said, leaning back slightly. "People's signatures vary. Age, stress, even the pen can affect it. But I've seen enough documents to know when something doesn't match the pattern." Pattern. That word stayed with me. Because my father wasn't inconsistent, he was precise. His signature, like everything else about him, followed a structure that didn't change easily. "What do you want to do?" I asked. Marcus considered for a moment. "For now, I'm saving a notarized copy," he said. "Just in case. If it's legitimate, no harm done. If it's not, we'll have a baseline." I nodded, accepting the logic without fully processing the implication. At that point, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a detail, something to file away, something to revisit if necessary. And for a while, that's exactly what I did. I filed it away. I didn't call my father. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even allow myself to dwell on it for too long, because acknowledging what it might mean would have required questioning something I wasn't ready to question yet. It would have meant considering the possibility that the dynamics I had spent years tolerating, minimizing, rationalizing had crossed into something else entirely, something intentional, something illegal. And at that time, I wasn't ready to make that shift. So I focused on work, on numbers, on everything that could be controlled, measured, explained. But the detail didn't disappear. It lingered, resurfacing in small, quiet moments when my mind wasn't occupied. The way Marcus had set off, not casually, but with the kind of restraint that suggested certainty beneath it. The way he had immediately secured a copy without being asked. The way I had felt deep down that he wasn't just noting an irregularity but recognizing something familiar. Months passed. Life continued. And then February 2025 arrived, and with it a kind of clarity I hadn't experienced before. It didn't come from a single event. It came from accumulation, stress, exhaustion, the slow realization that the life I had built while stable was also unsustainable in its current form. I stopped sleeping. Not the occasional restless night, but entire stretches where my mind refused to shut down, cycling through scenarios, decisions, projections, as if it were trying to solve something I hadn't consciously defined yet. My doctor called it burnout. Elevated cortisol levels, chronic stress response, the kind that doesn't resolve on its own. She told me to take 6 months off. No negotiation. And for the first time in years, I listened. I resigned at the end of February, walking away from a career that had defined me for nearly a decade, not because I had a clear plan for what came next, but because I understood that continuing the way I had been wasn't an option. That decision created space, and space, I would learn, makes certain things impossible to ignore. Without the constant distraction of work, the details I had pushed aside began to surface again, clearer, now sharper. The transfer deed, the signature, Marcus's hesitation, and then the phone call from Victoria on the night I moved into the beach house, the confidence in her voice, the assumption that she could rewrite reality without consequence, the ease with which she claimed authority over something that wasn't hers. That was the moment everything aligned. Because it wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. As if ownership, control, entitlement, those weren't boundaries to respect but variables to manipulate. And if she could do that verbally, if she could fabricate my father's words to my face without hesitation, then the idea of her fabricating his signature on a legal document was no longer abstract. It was consistent, predictable even. I called my father that night, and when he told me he had never agreed to anything Victoria had said, the last layer of doubt dissolved. The pattern was no longer theoretical. It was confirmed. And once something is confirmed, you can't return to not knowing. The next morning, I called Marcus. "I need to see that deed," I said. There was no hesitation on his end. "I'll send it over," he replied. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. When the document arrived in my inbox, I opened it immediately this time, not as a formality, but as an investigation. I pulled up other samples of my father's signature, his will, his medical power of attorney, even a birthday card he had sent me the previous year, and placed them side by side. The differences were undeniable now. Not subtle, not debatable, structural. The loop in the G, the spacing between letters. The rhythm of the strokes. One was written, the other was constructed. I stared at the comparison for a long time, not feeling shock in the way I might have expected, but something else entirely. Recognition. Because this wasn't just about a signature. It was about everything that had come before it. The years of quiet exclusion, the gradual erosion of boundaries, the normalization of behavior that viewed in isolation could be dismissed, but together formed a pattern that was now impossible to ignore. And in that moment something shifted inside me. Not emotionally, strategically. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was assessing. The question was no longer why would she do this, it was how far has this gone, and more importantly, what needs to happen next. That was the point where I stopped being the person who absorbed, who adjusted, who waited for things to resolve themselves. That was the point where I became the person who acts. Once I stopped asking whether something was wrong and started asking how much had been taken, the numbers began to assemble themselves with a clarity that was almost clinical, as if the truth had been waiting for me to look at it properly, before revealing its full shape. Marcus didn't waste time once I told him to proceed. Within hours of reviewing the transfer deed again, he had already begun pulling additional records, cross-referencing accounts, flagging irregularities that on their own might have been dismissed as administrative noise, but together formed a pattern that was anything but accidental. The first confirmation came from the property itself. The Mount Pleasant house, appraised at approximately $1.2 million, had been transferred into an entity I had never heard of, Hale Premier Properties LLC. The name alone was enough to tighten something in my chest. Hale, Victoria's maiden name. I accessed the South Carolina Secretary of State's Business Registry and found the filing within minutes. Registered November 2022. Sole member Victoria R. Hale. No partners, no oversight. No legitimate connection to my father. The house hadn't just been moved. It had been redirected quietly, deliberately, into something she controlled entirely. That was the first layer. Then Marcus called me the next morning with the second. "There are withdrawals from your father's IRA," he said, his voice steady in the way it always was when he was dealing with facts instead of speculation. 4 transactions spread across January to October 2024, total $380,000. I sat down as he spoke, not because I felt dizzy, but because I needed to be still to process it. My father's IRA wasn't something he accessed casually. It was structured long-term, protected by the kind of caution that came from years of advising other people to do the same. "Where did the money go?" I asked. "Coastal Heritage Bank," Marcus replied. "Account registered under the name V. Hale. Not joint, not shared. Hers." The pattern was becoming clearer, but it still wasn't complete. "There's more," he added. Of course there was. There's always more once you start looking. A supplementary credit card was opened under your father's name. Same social security number, same credit profile, but the application lists an authorized user, Victoria. I closed my eyes, briefly picturing the process. The paperwork, the verification steps she would have had to bypass or manipulate to make it happen. "Current balance?" I asked. $47,000, he said. Charges include a luxury spa retreat in Hilton Head, 2 Chanel handbags, first-class airfare to New York, and several high-end retail transactions, none of which appear in your father's personal records. I didn't need him to say the obvious, none of which he had approved. By that point, the individual pieces were already forming a structure in my mind, but Marcus wasn't finished. "There's a third account," he said. "Savings account titled V. Hale Trust. Balance $215,000. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less precise, less real. "Source?" I asked. "Transfers from your father's joint household account," Marcus said. "Categorized as routine expenses, groceries, maintenance, utilities. But the funds were redirected into this separate account." I did the math automatically, not because I wanted to, but because it was what I had trained myself to do for years. $1.2 million for the house. $380,000 from the IRA. $47,000 on the credit card. $215, 0 inches the trust account. Total $1,842,000. Nearly $2 million. Not missing, not mismanaged. Taken. Systematically over time, in amounts that were large enough to matter but structured in a way that avoided immediate detection. That was the part that changed everything for me. Not just the scale, but the method. This wasn't impulsive, it wasn't reckless, it was calculated. Each transaction designed to blend into normal activity, each account separated just enough to avoid direct overlap, each decision reflecting an understanding of how financial systems could be navigated, manipulated, exploited. We'll need certified statements to make this hold legally. Marcus continued, already moving into the next phase. Already thinking about evidence admissibility process. I'll file a subpoena with Charleston County Court. Estimated turnaround 30 to 45 days. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. My focus wasn't on the timeline. It was on the realization that had settled into place with the final number. For years I had framed Victoria's behavior in emotional terms, controlling, dismissive, manipulative in ways that affected relationships, dynamics, perception. But this wasn't that. Or rather, it wasn't only that. This was financial exploitation, fraud, identity misuse, actions that existed not in the gray space of family conflict but in the defined structure of criminal law. And the person at the center of it, my father, was exactly the kind of individual the law was designed to protect. In these cases, a 63-year-old man with a documented cardiac history, trusting the person closest to him to manage what he no longer monitored as closely. Himself. Vulnerable. Not because he was incapable, but because he believed he didn't need to question what was happening in his own home. That trust had been weaponized. I opened my laptop and began organizing the data, not because Marcus needed me to, but because I needed to see it in one place, structured, undeniable. Dates, amounts, accounts, patterns. The numbers didn't fluctuate. They didn't soften. They remained exactly what they were, regardless of how I felt about them. And that was the point. Because emotion can be challenged. It can be dismissed, reframed, questioned. Numbers can't. They either exist or they don't. And these did. Every dollar accounted for, every transfer traceable. Every signature real or forged, anchored to a document that could be examined, verified, contested if necessary but not erased. I sat there for a long time after Marcus ended the call, the spreadsheet open in front of me. The total at the bottom of the column highlighted in a way that made it impossible to ignore. $1,842,000. I had built my entire life around understanding systems, identifying inefficiencies, correcting imbalances, and now I was looking at one that existed inside my own family, one that had been operating in parallel with everything else for longer than I had realized. The shock wasn't explosive. It didn't come with tears or raised voices or immediate confrontation. It came as a quiet, irreversible shift in perception. Because once you see something clearly, you can't go back to interpreting it differently. And in that moment I understood two things with absolute certainty. This wasn't going to resolve itself, and whatever happened next would need to be handled with the same precision that had created the problem in the first place. Once the numbers settled into something undeniable, the next question wasn't whether I should act, but how I would do it in a way that couldn't be undone, dismissed, or quietly negotiated into irrelevance. Because the truth about situations like this is that confrontation without structure only creates noise, and noise is easy to control, easy to redirect, easy to bury under performance and denial. And I had spent too many years watching Victoria manage perception to make the mistake of thinking this could be resolved with a conversation behind closed doors. So I approached it, the only way I knew how, like a system that needed to be dismantled piece by piece, with precision, timing, and evidence. strong enough to withstand scrutiny from people who had no emotional investment in any of us. I broke the plan into 3 phases, not because I needed to formalize it, but because clarity reduces hesitation, and hesitation was the one thing I could not afford. Phase 1 was documentation, and it began immediately. Every document Marcus and I had identified: transfer deeds, bank statements, account records, corporate registrations, had to be collected, verified, and organized into a structure that could be understood without explanation, because the strength of evidence isn't just in what it proves, but in how clearly it can be presented. Marcus filed the subpoena request with Charleston County Court within days, initiating the process to obtain certified bank statements that would confirm the movement of funds beyond any question of authenticity, while Patricia Sloan, forensic document examiner he had recommended, began a full comparative analysis of the signatures, not just on the transfer deed, but across multiple documents to establish a pattern that would hold under legal examination. I reviewed everything myself, line by line, not because I doubted the work, but because understanding the details meant I could anticipate where it might be challenged, where it might be misinterpreted, where it needed reinforcement. At the same time, I started documenting everything happening in real time: the conversations, the assumptions, the behavior that reflected intent. Victoria didn't know she was being observed. That was the advantage of years spent being overlooked. She continued as she always had, confident, careless, in ways that only someone who has never been held accountable can be, and I let her. I paid the invoices she left for me, the $12,000, for furniture she had ordered, without asking the groceries for dinners she hosted in my house, as if it were hers, because every action she took reinforced the narrative she believed she controlled. And the more comfortable she became, the more predictable she was. Phase 2 was protection, and it was more delicate because it involved my father, and timing mattered as much as truth. If I told him too early, he would confront her immediately, not out of strategy but out of instinct, and that would give her time to react, to shift assets, to construct a version of events that could complicate everything before we were ready. If I told him too late, he would feel blindsided, betrayed in a different way, and I needed him to be steady, informed, prepared for what was coming. So we chose a specific moment: June 1st, 2 weeks before the gala. Enough time for him to process, to sign an affidavit confirming he had never authorized any of the transactions, to begin transferring oversight of his finances to an independent fiduciary who could prevent further damage, but not enough time for Victoria to dismantle what we had built. When I showed him the documents on the beach that morning, I didn't frame it as accusation or emotion. I presented it the way I would present a case to a client: facts first, implications second, conclusions last. He read everything, every page, every number, and when he said quietly that he had never signed any of it, never approved any of it, that was the confirmation we needed, not emotionally, but legally. Marcus notarized his affidavit 2 days later, creating a sworn statement that anchored the entire case in something that could not be reinterpreted. Phase 3 was the reveal, and this was where the strategy shifted from containment to exposure. Because the question was no longer just how to stop Victoria, but how to do it in a way that prevented her from controlling the narrative afterward. If this happened in private, she would deny, deflect, reposition herself as misunderstood, as a victim of miscommunication, and there would be no definitive moment where the truth replaced her version of events. But if it happened in public, in a space where reputation mattered, where evidence could be presented in front of people whose opinions carried weight, the outcome would be different. The Low Country Bar Association's annual charity gala was scheduled for June 14th, and Victoria was being honored as Philanthropist of the Year. The irony was almost too precise to ignore. The very platform she had built her image on would become the stage where it unraveled. Marcus arranged a meeting with Judge Raymond Holt, the president of the association, presenting the evidence in advance so that the reveal would not be seen as disruption, but as a matter requiring immediate attention under the association's own bylaws. At the same time, I contacted Della Fairchild, a senior editor with both credibility and reach, ensuring that whatever happened that night would not remain contained within the room. Every piece was positioned deliberately. The evidence compiled into a single manila envelope organized in the exact sequence it would be presented. The forensic report, the bank statements, the affidavit, the corporate registration. Even a screenshot of Victoria's browser history showing her search for how to add a name to a property deed in South Carolina timestamp device identified impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Throughout all of it, I remained outwardly unchanged. I didn't confront her. I didn't hint at what I knew. I continued to move through the house the way I always had, quiet, accommodating, invisible in the ways she expected, because the effectiveness of the plan depended on her believing there was no plan at all. That was the difference between who I had been and who I was now. Before, I had absorbed, adapted, waited for things to shift on their own. Now I observed, calculated, acted with intention. There was no anger driving it, no desire for revenge in the way people imagine it. There was only clarity. A system had been built that exploited trust, and systems like that don't collapse because someone asks them to. They collapse when they are exposed, documented, and removed from the conditions that allow them to exist. By the time June 14th arrived, everything was in place. Not because it had been rushed, but because it had been constructed carefully, step by step, with the understanding that when the moment came, there would be no second chance to get it right. The final piece didn't come from a document or a bank statement or anything Marcus could subpoena through the court system. It came from a stranger who already knew her bed, and in a way that made it the most dangerous and the most clarifying piece of all. The text message arrived the evening before the gala from a number I didn't recognize, simple and direct, in a way that suggested certainty rather than curiosity. I know Victoria isn't who you think she is. Meet me tomorrow. Initials at the end, HB. At any other time, I might have ignored it. I had spent weeks building a case based on verifiable evidence, on facts that could stand in a courtroom, and the last thing I needed was something that felt ambiguous, emotional, unstructured. But there was something about the phrasing that caught my attention, not accusation, not speculation, but knowledge. I know. That wasn't someone guessing, that was someone remembering. I met her the next afternoon at Waterfront Park. The kind of place where conversations can happen in plain sight without being overheard, where the noise of the city and the movement of people create a kind of anonymity that feels almost intentional. She introduced herself as Helen Briggs, and the moment she said the last name, something in my mind shifted before she even began to explain why she was there. Briggs. It didn't connect immediately to anything I had uncovered, but it felt familiar in a way that suggested relevance. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Victoria was married before your father, she said, her tone calm, practiced like someone who had told this story to herself many times before deciding to tell it to someone else. His name was Richard Briggs, my ex-husband. The connection settled into place then, not as a coincidence but as a continuation. Helen explained that the marriage had ended in 2009, not because of incompatibility or distance, or any of the reasons people typically offer to make things sound clean, but because Richard had discovered that Victoria had been transferring money, significant amounts, $190,000, in total from their joint accounts into a separate account she controlled under her maiden name. Not gradually enough to be invisible, but carefully enough to be dismissed, at first categorized as expenses, adjustments, things that could be explained until they couldn't. He didn't press charges, Helen said, her voice steady but carrying something underneath it that sounded like regret. He wanted it to be over, clean, no scandal, no public exposure. I understood that instinct immediately. The desire to contain something like that, to resolve it quietly, to avoid the fallout that comes with making it visible. It was the same instinct I had almost followed myself before the numbers forced me to reconsider. I respected that, she continued. For 16 years I stayed out of it. But then I saw your name. I saw what was happening, and I realized it wasn't isolated. It was a pattern. That was the word again, pattern. It had appeared in Marcus's office when he first looked at the signature and the structure of the financial transactions, in the way everything aligned once I started examining it closely. And now it extended beyond my father, beyond my family, into something larger, something repeatable. Helen handed me a folder certified copies of the divorce decree, highlighted sections referencing dissipation of marital assets, legal language that translated emotional betrayal into documented fact. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't rumor. It was recorded, adjudicated, preserved. 2 marriages, 2 sets of accounts, 2 instances of money being moved, redirected, taken under circumstances that relied on trust to function. And suddenly, everything I had uncovered over the past weeks rearranged itself into something far more structured than I had initially understood. This wasn't opportunistic. It wasn't situational. It was systematic. Victoria didn't just take advantage of circumstances. She created them. She identified environments where she could operate with minimal resistance, relationships built on trust, on emotional dependency, on the assumption that financial decisions didn't need to be questioned closely, and then she inserted herself into positions of control. From there, the process was consistent access, gradual redirection of funds, justification through narrative, and when necessary, fabrication to maintain that narrative. The forged signature on my father's property wasn't an escalation, it was a refinement. A more efficient version of something she had already done before. That realization changed the way I saw everything. Up until that point, I had been focused on proving what she had done in this specific instance, documenting the transactions, establishing the forgery, building a case that would hold legally. But now I understood that what I was dealing with wasn't just a set of actions. It was a system she had developed over time, one that relied on predictability, on the assumption that no one would connect the dots across different contexts, different relationships, different timelines. And that assumption had held. Until now. I looked at Helen, at the composure she maintained while describing something that had clearly cost her more than she was showing. And I recognized something I hadn't fully articulated before. This wasn't just about my father. It wasn't even just about me. It was about a pattern that had gone unchecked long enough to repeat itself. Why now? I asked. Why tell me? Helen didn't hesitate. Because you're the first person who didn't look away, she said. And because if you're going to do this, you need to understand exactly what you're dealing with. That was the moment it shifted from confirmation to strategy. Because evidence proves what happened. Patterns explain how it happens. And understanding how something works is what allows you to stop it effectively. I took the folder from her, feeling its weight in a way that had nothing to do with the paper itself, and nodded once. Not in agreement, not in gratitude, but in acknowledgement. The system was complete now, not in the sense that it was finished, but in the sense that it was fully visible. And once something like that becomes visible, it can't be managed the way it was before. It has to be dismantled. The ballroom was designed to impress before anyone even spoke, the kind of space that made people sit a little straighter, smile a little wider, as if the room itself demanded a performance worthy of its scale. Crystal chandeliers hung low enough to catch the light in a way that scattered it across the polished floors. Each table dressed in white linen and fine china, every detail curated to reinforce the same unspoken message. This is where reputations are built, displayed, and protected. 220 guests filled the room. Attorneys, judges, donors, executives, people who understood the weight of appearances and the cost of losing them. Their conversations blending into a soft, controlled hum that never quite became noise. Victoria moved through that space as if she belonged to it, as if it had been arranged for her specifically. Her champagne-colored gown, catching the light with every step, her smile practiced, effortless. the culmination of weeks spent preparing for this exact moment. She greeted people by name, leaned in at precisely the right angle, laughed at exactly the right volume, every interaction reinforcing the image she had spent years constructing generous, composed, untouchable. She took her seat at table 1 directly in front of the stage, the position reserved for the honoree, while my father sat beside her, his posture rigid, his silence deliberate in a way that went unnoticed by everyone except me. I was seated at table 18 near the back, where the service staff moved in and out through a side entrance exactly where Victoria had expected me to be present, but peripheral part of the scene, but not central to it. Marcus sat to my left, his briefcase resting quietly at his feet, the manila envelope inside it, containing everything that mattered, everything that would shift the direction of the night in a way no one in that room could anticipate. At table 12, I could see Helen, composed, observant, her presence almost invisible, unless you knew to look for it, and across the room in the press section, Della adjusted her recorder, already preparing to capture whatever unfolded. The evening progressed as expected. At first, introductions, speeches, polite applause, the rhythm of an event that followed a script everyone understood. And then, at 8:30, the script changed. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, his smile faltering just slightly as he glanced toward the side of the stage where Judge Raymond Holt stood waiting, his expression measured, deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC began, his voice steady but lacking its earlier ease. "Before we proceed with the awards presentation, the association has a brief matter to address." The room quieted, not abruptly but gradually, conversations tapering off as attention shifted forward, curiosity replacing comfort. Victoria straightened in her chair, smoothing the fabric of her gown, her smile still in place but her fingers tightening around her napkin just enough to betray the first hint of unease. Judge Holt stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding, without needing to be forceful, the kind of authority that comes from years of making decisions that carry consequences. Under Section 7.3 of the Low Country Bar Association's bylaws, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, any substantiated allegation of financial misconduct involving a nominee must be addressed prior to the N7 conferral of any honor. A murmur moved through the audience, subtle but unmistakable, the sound of 220 people recalibrating their expectations at the same time. Victoria rose before he could continue, her voice cutting through the room with controlled urgency. "This is highly inappropriate," she said, her tone calibrated between indignation and disbelief. "This is a charity event, not a courtroom." Judge Holt didn't respond to her directly. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the back of the room. "Miss Bonnie Beckett," he said, "you've been invited to present your evidence." For a moment, everything seemed to pause, as if the room itself needed time to process what had just been said. And then the attention shifted, rows of heads turning, conversations stopping entirely, the weight of collective focus settling on table 18. Victoria's eyes found mine immediately, and in that instant, across the distance of 17 tables, something passed between us that had nothing to do with words, recognition, not of what was happening, but of the fact that whatever she thought she controlled, she didn't anymore. I stood slowly, aware of every movement, every sound, the faint echo of my heels against the floor, as I walked forward, the manila envelope steady in my hand, Marcus rising briefly beside me, as if to confirm that everything was exactly where it needed to be. The walk felt longer than it was, not because of distance but because of attention. 220 people, watching, assessing, trying to understand what they were about to witness. I stepped onto the stage, placed the envelope on the podium, and looked out at the room, not searching for anyone in particular, just taking in the moment as it existed before it changed. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone," I began, my voice clear, steady, carrying without strain. "I came here because the truth couldn't wait any longer." I opened the envelope and removed the first document, holding it up, just as the projection screen behind me illuminated with a high-resolution image of the transfer deed. On April 12, 2024, I continued. A property valued at $1.2 million was transferred from Gerald Beckett to an entity called Hale Premier Properties LLC. I let the name settle, let the connection form in real time for the people in the room who understood exactly what it implied. This signature, I said, indicating the name at the bottom of the document, is not my father's. The next slide appeared a side-by-side comparison authentic signatures, contrasted with the one on the deed, the differences visible even from the back of the room. This analysis was conducted by Patricia Sloan, a forensic document examiner with over 40 federal cases of testimony, I said. Her conclusion: the signature is a simulated forgery at the highest probability level recognized in her field. The room had gone completely silent now, not out of politeness, but out of something heavier, something that held attention in place. My father stood then, not because he had been prompted, but because he understood the moment required it. "I did not sign that document," he said, his voice hoarse but unmistakably clear. "I did not authorize the transfer of my home." The words landed with a weight that no document could replicate, the combination of evidence and testimony closing any space for interpretation. I moved to the next set of documents, the bank statements, the transactions, the numbers displayed in precise sequence. Between January and October 2024, I said, $380,000 was withdrawn from my father's retirement account and deposited into an account under the name V. Hale. Another slide. An additional $47,000 was charged to a credit card opened under his identity without his knowledge. Another. And $215,000 was transferred from a joint account into a separate trust categorized as household expenses. I paused just long enough for the total to register. The total amount diverted approximately $1.842 million. No one spoke. No one moved. The room had shifted entirely now, from admiration to analysis, from performance to reality. Victoria's composure fractured in stages, first disbelief, then denial, then something sharper, more desperate. "This is a misunderstanding," she said, her voice breaking just enough to suggest emotion. "Gerald gave me access to everything." My father didn't look at her when he responded. He looked at me, then back at the room. "I did not," he said. And that was the moment it ended, not with a dramatic collapse, not with raised voices or chaos, but with something far more definitive, the complete, irreversible replacement of narrative with fact. The aftermath moved quickly, not in the chaotic way people expect after something public and explosive, but with a kind of structured momentum that felt almost inevitable once the evidence had been laid out in a room that understood its weight. By the next morning, the informal shock of the gala had already begun to convert into formal action, because in environments where reputation and law intersect, what is revealed doesn't stay in the realm of conversation for long, becomes process. Marcus initiated the first step before most people had finished their morning coffee, filing a formal criminal complaint with the Charleston County Sheriff's Office, supported by the full evidence package we had presented: the forged transfer deed, the forensic report confirming simulation, the FORES AT certified bank statements tracing the movement of funds, and my father's notarized affidavit stating unequivocally that he had authorized none of it. The charges recommended were precise and deliberate, no exaggeration, no overreach, because credibility mattered as much as substance. Forgery in the first-degree exploitation of a vulnerable adult, identity fraud related to the unauthorized credit account, and misappropriation of funds tied to the trust transfers. Each one carried its own legal definition, its own burden of proof, and its own potential consequences, measured not in symbolic penalties but in years. Within 48 hours, the sheriff's office opened an official investigation, and Victoria was instructed to present herself for questioning. At the same time, the financial institutions involved responded in the only way they could once the documentation reached them: by securing what remained. Coastal Heritage Bank froze the accounts associated with the name V. Hale, including both the savings account and the trust account, effectively locking approximately $595 0 inches place pending the outcome of the investigation. The credit card account was suspended. Transactions halted, the balance flagged as disputed under potential fraud review. The property transfer, now under scrutiny, triggered a legal review that prevented any further changes to the title until the validity of the original deed could be resolved. What had been fluid, movable, quietly redirected money became fixed, traceable, contained. Victoria's access to the system she had been operating within narrowed almost overnight, not because of confrontation, but because the system itself responded to documented irregularity in the way it was designed to. On the personal side, the shift was just as immediate, though less visible to anyone outside the family. My father filed for divorce on Monday morning, grounds cited clearly in the petition fraud upon the marriage and dissipation of marital assets. The language was formal, structured, but the meaning was simple. What had happened was not a misunderstanding, not a breakdown in communication, but a violation that carried legal and personal consequences at the same time. The filing initiated a process that would move through its own timeline, but the decision itself was final the moment the documents were submitted. Victoria's response followed a predictable pattern: first denial, then negotiation. Through her attorney, she proposed a settlement return. The money, close the accounts, resolve the matter privately, avoid criminal escalation. On the surface, it might have sounded reasonable, even pragmatic, the kind of resolution that allowed everyone to step back without further damage. But the structure of it revealed its purpose. It wasn't about restitution, it was about containment. If accepted, it would have reframed the situation as a dispute rather than a crime, something negotiable rather than prosecutable. I didn't need time to consider it. No settlement, I told Marcus. We proceed as filed. That decision set the direction for everything that followed. The case moved forward, not as a private matter, but as part of the legal system, where evidence is examined, verified, challenged, and ultimately resolved within a framework that doesn't adjust itself based on discomfort or reputation. By midweek, Victoria had retained a criminal defense attorney, someone experienced, well-regarded, someone who understood both the legal and social dimensions of a case like this. Her public position remained consistent: denial, anticipation of clearing her name through due process, but the environment around her had already shifted. The organization she had been affiliated with responded quickly, not out of judgment, but out of risk management. The Low Country Bar Association formally rescinded the award that had been scheduled for presentation, citing the substantiated allegations and the ongoing investigation. The foundation she had built began an internal audit, examining its own financial records to determine whether the pattern extended beyond personal accounts. Sponsors paused their involvement, some withdrawing entirely, not because the case had been decided, but because the association itself carried uncertainty. Reputation, once questioned, becomes a variable, and institutions adjust accordingly. Within a week, the legal structure was fully in motion. Subpoenas expanded the scope of the investigation, tracing additional transactions, confirming timelines, establishing context. The total amount in question was recalculated as more data became available, rising from the initial $1.842 million to approximately $1.92 million when misallocated foundation funds were included. The grand jury returned a formal indictment shortly after 4 felony counts corresponding to the charges originally filed, each supported by the documentation already on record. Victoria surrendered at the county courthouse, posted bail, and was released under conditions that included a restraining order, no contact with my father, no access to the accounts under investigation, and a monitored limitation on her movement through an ankle device that ensured compliance without the need for constant oversight. The transition from control to restriction was complete. What had once been managed privately, invisibly, became defined by external structures, by timelines and procedures that operated independently of her influence. For my father, the changes were quieter but just as significant. The financial oversight he had previously delegated was transferred to an independent fiduciary, ensuring that every account, every asset, every transaction moved through a system designed to prevent exactly what had happened. The divorce proceedings progressed alongside the criminal case, separate but related, each addressing different aspects of the same set of actions. And through all of it, the pace remained steady, deliberate, not rushed, not delayed, but moving forward in a way that reflected the difference between reaction and process. Because once something enters the legal system with sufficient evidence behind it, it doesn't depend on emotion or narrative to continue. It follows its own path. 6 months later, the house felt different, not because anything about it had changed physically. The same ocean stretched out beyond the porch, the same rhythm of waves, marking time in a way that no clock ever could, but because I had. The version of me who first sat there that night, phone in hand, absorbing a voice that had defined my place in the world for years, no longer existed in the same way. And the absence of that version wasn't something I mourned, it was something I finally understood. My father moved into the guest cottage at the edge of the property not long after the divorce was finalized, close enough that we could share space, when we chose to far enough that we could both relearn what independence looked like without interference. The first few weeks were quiet between us, not out of distance but out of adjustment. There are conversations that can't be rushed, realizations that need space to settle before they can be spoken out loud. He started therapy, something he told me about with a kind of straightforward honesty I hadn't seen from him in years, not as a performance of change, but as a recognition that something in him needed to be understood if anything was going to be different moving forward. I spent so long trusting the wrong things, he said one evening, standing beside me on the porch, his hands resting on the railing in a way that mirrored my own. I don't want to do that again. It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense, but it carried more weight than one because it acknowledged the pattern without trying to minimize it, without asking me to accept it as something inevitable. And for the first time in a long time, our conversations felt equal, not structured around what was left unsaid, but built on what we were both willing to confront directly. Page's shift was slower, more uneven, but no less real. She reached out a few weeks after everything settled, not with a call but with a letter, 3 handwritten pages that arrived without a return address, as if she needed the distance even in the act of reaching forward. I recognized her handwriting immediately, the small details unchanged, despite everything else that had shifted around us. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't justify what had happened. She described what she had seen, what she had ignored, the ways she had benefited from the same dynamic that had excluded me, and for the first time she named it without softening it. I knew she wrote. I didn't say anything because it was easier not to. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else in the letter, not because it was surprising, but because it was honest in a way that required something from both of us moving forward. We met a few weeks later, cautiously, without expectations, beyond conversation. It wasn't easy, it wasn't immediate, but it was real, and that mattered more than anything else. Healing, I realized, isn't about restoring what was there before. It's about deciding what you're willing to build now that you see everything clearly. Professionally, I didn't return to the life I had left behind. Meridian had offered to take me back the door, exactly where it had always been: open, predictable, familiar. But familiarity was no longer what I was looking for. I founded Beckett Advisory Group instead, a small, independent consulting practice built on the same principles I had spent years applying to other people's systems: clarity, structure, accountability, but this time on my own terms. The first few months were uncertain in the way any new venture is, but uncertainty felt different when it was chosen rather than imposed. My first clients came through referrals, then through reputation, and within a quarter, the work had stabilized into something sustainable, something that reflected not just what I could do but how I wanted to do it. I wasn't proving anything anymore. I was building something that aligned with who I had become. Victoria's trial was scheduled for the following spring. I didn't follow every development. I didn't need to. The outcome, whatever it would be, existed within a system that no longer required my constant attention. The part I needed to do was done. The rest belonged to a process designed to handle exactly what had happened. What stayed with me instead were the quieter shifts, the ones that didn't make headlines or require documentation. The way my father started cooking again, even if the meals weren't particularly good. The way Paige learned to sit in conversations without deflecting, without performing certainty where there was none. The way I could wake up in the morning, walk out onto the porch, and feel something that had nothing to do with achievement or validation, or being seen by anyone else. Peace isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in gradually, in the absence of things that used to feel normal but no longer exist. I kept my mother's letter in the same place I had placed it the night before. The Gala folded carefully, the paper worn slightly at the edges from being opened and closed more times than I could count. Her last words to me weren't instructions or warnings. They were simple, direct, something I hadn't fully understood when I first read them, but did now in a way that felt almost physical in its clarity. You are enough. Not when you prove it. Not when someone else acknowledges it. Always. For years, I had interpreted strength as endurance, as the ability to absorb, to adapt, to make myself smaller so that the system around me could remain stable. What I understand now is that strength is something else entirely. It's the decision to stop participating in something that requires you to disappear in order to function. It's the willingness to let things break if they are built on something that isn't true. And it's the recognition that boundaries aren't barriers meant to keep people out. They are structures that allow you to exist fully within your own life. That was the real outcome of everything that happened, not the exposure, not the legal consequences, not even the restoration of what had been taken. It was the shift from waiting to be included to choosing where I belong. And that, more than anything else, is what stayed.